Dead by Daylight is a very confusing game, considering it has over 41 different killers, over 49 different survivors, and a total of 297 different perks. And this is just going over the characters and the perks. We're not even talking about the gameplay, techs you can do, and with all of this information, the DBD in-game tutorial system is not very good at explaining what to do in Dead by Daylight. It teaches you the bare minimum of the basics, like how to hook people as killer, chase people, what scratch marks do, and for Survivor it tells you how to vault, throw down pallets, do gens, and save your teammates. This severe lack of information makes it really difficult to play Killer optimally and play Survivor optimally. So this video is going to be a full up-to-date 2025 version of how to play Dead by Daylight. Now, as of this recording, don't mind the background, it is the winter event currently. The first thing you should definitely do is go down to this options button and click it. In here, there are a few different things you should change, one being in the beta option. Here you can see the first person FOV. I would recommend turning this all the way up to the max. This basically means that when you play Killer, your FOV will be a little bit higher and a little bit wider, so you actually can be able to see around corners a little bit easier and be able to see survivors out of your field of view if this wasn't normally turned up to 103. Next thing we're going to talk about is the scratch mark color. This is something they recently just added to the game, which allows you to change the color of your scratch marks. Now, you can mess around with this just for fun, but also it's an extremely helpful feature because some maps, for example, like Coldwind Farm, it's very yellow. So if you use a blue filter on the scratch marks, it'll be a lot easier to see where the scratch marks are. So depending on which map you get, you can change the color of the scratch marks to make it a little bit easier for you to be able to tell where they're going and, you know, not get confused. The next thing you're going to want to do is go to graphics and go down to where it says gamma. Turning this all the way up greatly increases the brightness of your game, which makes it a lot easier just to see on really like dark maps. And it makes it easier to spot certain things. Now, I'm on PC, so I have shaders, so I don't really need to turn it up. But if you're not on PC, I highly recommend turning this up to a comfortable point where it's a lot brighter so you can actually see what's going on, but also not too annoying. Alright, next, go to your controls. And over here, you will see your sensitivity. Now, I think by default, if you're playing on mouse and keyboard, it's defaulted at 100%, but if you are playing on controller, I'm pretty sure this is not at 100%. I would recommend turning it up to 100% for a few different reasons. Now, at first you might not be used to it, but it helps a lot with being faster in your movements, because the way the game works is the way you turn your camera, certain angles, it can actually make you turn faster and make you swing corners easier. It also helps with 360ing, but we're not going to go over that in this video. That's a tech more than it is an actual viable strat to, you know, play DBD. But otherwise, I 100% recommend turning your sensitivity up to 100 for both Killer and Survivor. Next, you want to go to accessibility, the very last tab of the settings. On the very first tab of accessibility, there's the heartbeat visual support. 100% recommend turning this on. Basically what this will do is it'll show a little heart in your survivor, and this will get bigger or smaller depending on how close the killer is from you. This is really good to help judge how close the killer is without having to use your ears and listen to the different sounds of the tear radius. Now, you don't have to do this. I have colorblind mode on specifically for seeing scratch marks or seeing certain colors a little bit better, and it's not because me personally, I'm colorblind. It just helps in the game a little bit to help see things a little bit easier, because sometimes this game can be very dark, and it's sometimes really hard to spot things. So this is personal preference. If you want to turn it on, you can, or, you know, test with it, mess around with it, see if you like it, but otherwise this is completely preference. Alright, now hopefully once your settings are now optimized, I'm gonna go into Survivor real quick and just talk a little bit about perks, items, and offerings. So when you first start as Survivor, you're gonna start with the 4 top survivors, and they each come with their own teachable perks. Teachable perks means the perks that survivor comes with, and it's only theirs. Now, considering that there are over 297 perks in Dead by Daylight, there's a lot of things to read and learn about, considering that some characters, like the first row here, are non-licensable, which means they're not a licensed chapter or a licensed survivor. But then you have characters like Laurie Strode, who is a licensed survivor from the Halloween franchise, and she comes with teachable perks, but but she is behind a paywall. Now you can either unlock her by buying Auric Cells, or you can buy the Halloween chapter and get both Laurie Strode and Michael Myers. Now the reason I'm explaining this is because sometimes certain perks are really good and they're going to be locked behind certain paywalls. Now you don't necessarily have to buy the character in order to get the perks. If you click this little button right here called the Shrine of Secrets, there is a chance that in here you're going to have perks from licensed characters. And as of this recording, the animatronics perk is in here, which is Springtrap from FNAF, so he's a licensed character. Ellen Ripley, her perk is in here, she's also a licensed character. And Michonne, her perk is in here, and she's a licensed character from the Walking Dead franchise. I would recommend when you're starting off checking this to see if maybe there is some licensed perks in here if you want to buy them. This kind of eliminates having to buy, Ellen Ripley to get a perk you want on her. The way you purchase Shrine of Secrets perks is with the secondary currency called iridescent shards. Basically the way you earn these is as you level up your player level, not your character level, you will unlock iridescent shards, and you unlock more and more the higher level you get. Now, because there are a lot of perks in this game, I highly recommend taking the time and reading. There is going to be a lot of reading in this game. For example, Dwight's perk, Prove Thyself. For every other survivor working on a generator within 4-meter range, gain 10% repair speed bonus. This same bonus is also applied to the other survivors within range. Survivors can only be affected by one Prove Thyself effect at a time. So as I just read that off, this game can be very confusing because then there are things that can stack, which means you can stack multiple effects on top of each other, and there are some things that can't be stacked, and there's also just percentages, and there's all this other information going on constantly. Now, I'm not going to go super in depth on perks and explain every little thing about every single perk and all that. I'm here to just explain to you that perks are what make DBD fun and also give you the upper hand in the match. So instead of just throwing out a bunch of random perks, take the time and learn it. Also would recommend every other few months DBD will release game modes or little modifiers that change up the game, and there's one particularly called Chaos Shuffle. This game mode gives you 4 random perks for the entire trial. This is kind of a good game mode if you're new. You can go in, try them out. If you don't know what it does, all you have to do is pause the game and put your cursor over the perk and you can read it and, see what it does. But other than that, let's move on from perks. Next thing I want to take some time to talk about is items. Items are things you can bring into the trial and give you an advantage. They can be more powerful than perks depending on what you bring in and what rarity you bring in. You can give an item an add-on to give it a bonus effect, essentially. So really quickly, I'm going to go over every item and then give my best explanation on each item. Toolboxes. There are different rarities of toolboxes. Now I understand if it's a little bit confusing because I have a pack that changes the icons. Anything that is green for me will be blue for you, and anything that will be yellow for me will be green for you. Just try to keep that in mind. These all variation in rarity, purple being the highest. They all increase the speed of which you do a generator at, and they each have different charges. Charges are how many uses it basically has. So for example, a Commodious toolbox has 32 charges. This doesn't mean you can use it 32 times. It's more like a progression bar. So there are 32 total uses, but as you work on a generator with a Commodious toolbox, that bar begins to go down slowly. Now as you can see, toolboxes also unlock the sabotage action. This basically means you can get rid of hooks by saboting them, and depending on add-ons or certain perks, they can increase the amount of time for the hook to respawn or speed up the process at which you sabotage a hook. For example, a Mechanics toolbox, its repair speed is 75%. But a Commodious toolbox is only 50%, but also it's 50% sabotage speed. So different toolboxes can be used for different types of actions depending on how you play the game. Now medkits basically do all of the same things. They just have different charges and decrease the amount of time it requires to heal either yourself or somebody else. How medkits basically work is that you bring one in and you can use it on yourself to self-heal, but it will use up the entire medkit. But if you decide to heal somebody else with your medkit, it will deplete the amount of charges slower, which means you can actually get 2 full heals off on somebody else. Next thing I'm going to talk about are flashlights. Now, flashlights are something that when you're a beginner, I do not recommend bringing in because you are going to evidently waste more time trying to use it than you are getting value out of it. What flashlights do is they give you the ability to blind the killer. Now, this can be used in different circumstances. Like, for example, if I stun the killer with a pallet, I can blind the killer, which temporarily blinds their screen, and that means I have some distance I can make to another tile or another loop. The other thing that flashlights can be used for is when a killer downs a survivor. When they are in the pickup animation, which means they are picking up the survivor to put them on their shoulder, in that animation you have a split window to shine your flashlight at the killer. This will stun the killer temporarily, dropping the survivor and actually saving them from, getting hooked or whatever. Now, it is easier to flashlight save now, but I still do not recommend running flashlights. Next thing I want to talk about is maps. Maps are actually kind of useful for beginners now. They give some insight on where pallets and vaults are, which can be extremely useful. If you're trying to learn maps or trying to learn how to jump from tile to tile or know where things are or what hasn't been used or what has been used. So maps are pretty good. They can also create beacons. Basically what this means is you can ping something. Basically every survivor can see this ping, and that means they would know that something is over there. The next item I'm going to talk about are smoke bombs. Now, as of this current version, they're not the greatest. Basically, when you use a charge on it, it creates this giant smoke screen, which can be helpful in certain scenarios because it will muffle your audio and make it a little bit hard to see, but only if you're using the good versions of the smoke bombs. The lesser rarities aren't as good. With add-ons, you can help increase this and make it more difficult for the killer to find you in the smoke, but it all really comes down to timing. If you time it in a certain location, like popping it inside of Killer Shack, for example, as the killer is entering Killer Shack, you can probably get some good value out of it. And the last item on here is keys. Keys are really only useful for two situations. One being that either skeleton keys or dull keys, they can open the hatch. Hatch is basically a second escape option besides the exit gates, and if the killer ends up closing hatch, you can open it with a key, allowing you to escape. The only other useful scenario I could see keys being used in are with certain add-ons can reveal auras to you, similar to maps, but a little bit stronger. So for example, if I put on the Blood Amber add-on, I can see the killer's aura within 32 meters. This can be useful at loops. If I don't know where the killer is, I can use this add-on to help me see where the killer is. These are like the only instances where keys are really strong. Otherwise, they're not the greatest. Now, there are lots of offerings in the game, but I'm only going to go over the really useful ones, those being the blood point offerings. Now, there are the really good blood point offerings like Bloody Party Streamers that grant a 100 bonus blood points in all categories for every single player. The reason I'm going to talk about this is you should probably bring in any form of blood point offering because you're going to need to get blood points. You're going to need to grind out your survivors. You need to upgrade your blood web to get perks unlocked and upgrade your characters because, for example, prestiging is a thing in this game. Basically means that you get your character to a certain level and you can basically restart them. You still keep all your perks and items, but you basically reset them to level 0 again. Now, if you get a character to prestige 3, this will unlock all of their teachable perks. So Dwight's 3 teachable perks will be unlocked for every other character that I have unlocked. This basically means that if I don't want to play as Dwight, but I want to use his teachable perks, I can get him to prestige 3 and then use his perks on someone like Claudette, for example. There are also map offerings that can be semi-important, but they've been severely nerfed to the point where they're not as great as they used to be. Basically, what map offerings do now is they have a 25% chance of sending you to that map. So you're not guaranteed. I would recommend only bringing in map offerings if you want to go to a map and try it out, but although you could just go into a custom game with your friends and also test out the maps there if you wanted to learn them, for example. Now, really quickly, we're going to go into Killer. I'm going to sit here and explain a little bit on how to have a easier understanding and how killer powers work. Now, for example, some killers are really simple. Trapper over here, the only thing he does is place traps and picks up traps. That is basically his fundamental power. Even the tutorial teaches you how to play Trapper. But comparing Trapper to someone like the Lich is just not even comparable at all. For example, the Lich has a lot of different stuff going on with his power, and it's honestly kind of complicated to explain. As you can see here over his power icon, you can just see all of the different stuff compared to trapper. If you buy a new killer and you go over their power and see that there's just a lot of information and maybe you can't understand every single thing that's going on, go play a custom game. In custom games, you can add bots. So basically what this means is that if I go over here to custom game, I can play as the killer that I just bought, and I have no idea what they do, and I can add bots into my lobby. Basically, this means that I can go and test out this killer without having to stress about having to go against real players, and this will give me some time to be able to experiment and test out how this killer works and how their power works. Don't just willy-nilly it. Don't just buy a killer and then, skip over their entire power. Take the time and read their power. Try to understand it the best you can. If you don't understand it, go play a custom game against some bots. Highly recommend doing that. I've done that a few times to, get a better understanding on how killer powers work, because honestly, over the last couple of years, DBD's getting very creative with their killer powers, so it's getting more complicated as the game progresses. Killer powers can have add-ons. This basically just gives the killer power a benefit or a bonus in some form of way. Now, I'm not going to go over every single add-on for everybody. Take the time and read the add-ons, Another small thing I want to talk about is that certain killers move at different speeds. This can typically be arranged in a way where if a killer has a projectile like Huntress, she actually moves slower than someone like Trapper. So if you kind of keep in mind that if a killer has a projectile, now not every killer, but most killers that have a throwable projectile will actually move slower than a killer that doesn't have projectiles. Alright, so with all of that, I think it is time to move on to some actual gameplay things. I'm going to start with Survivor first, and then I'm going to move to Killer and explain how to play both in ways that could probably help you a lot, becoming a better player at the game. Now, if you're brand new, it will give you a little warning on the loading screen. It'll say facing X whatever the killer might be. This is a good little hint for beginners that, kind of gives you some insight on what you're going up against. So, when you first load into a match, it might be terrifying, because when you're Survivor and you have, 3 other randos and a killer out there that God who knows what it is, the first thing you should try to do is try to find a generator. Now, I'm going to explain a little bit on how to find generators a little bit easier. Now, certain maps are going to depend. There are certain maps that are inside, so it's a giant building that you're basically inside of, and there are certain maps that are outside. It's all open and, it's outside. Now, if you spawn in an outside map, the best way to find gens is to kind of look up. If you see this pole with lights on it that are flickering, like it's unpowered, that means there's a gen right there that is uncompleted. If you're wandering around the map and find one that has lights all the way on that aren't flickering, that means the gen's already completed. You can also kind of judge where gens should spawn. For example, if the map you on has a main building that is outside, almost always there will be a gen inside the main building. Another couple easy ways to find gens are if you're inside of tiles. Tiles are like your weird walls that will spawn around the map. These tiles will sometimes have a generator in them, so keep an eye out for that. If you see a tile, there could be a generator. Also, on almost every map, there is a tile called Killer Shack. Now, Killer Shack has a few things in it. It has a basement that you can go down. It has a chest. It can also sometimes have a gen inside of it. Now, if you go into Killer Shack and you see that basement isn't there, basement is in main then, just so you're not confused and getting false information. This is basically all the ways to find generators like on an outdoor map. Now, if you're indoor, it can be a little bit more tricky. Indoor maps have these doors that kind of open and close, or they're just completely shut. I'm using the game here as an example. As you can see, there is this door that is shut, but right next to it, there is a gen. Now, if the gen isn't on that side, that means it's on the other side. So if you're having trouble finding generators on indoor maps, look for these doors. These doors typically mean there's a generator very close by, and when you complete it, this door will now open completely, giving you another pathway to go through, or giving you easier access to the other side instead of going all the way around. Now, in some cases, there are going to be indoor maps that don't have these doors that I've been talking about. In a scenario like this, certain gens on indoor maps will spawn in the same place. So for example, Larry's, the hospital map, there will always be a gen in the middle of the map, which is the part where there's a bunch of TVs kind of circling around. Other maps like this, like Midwich, will have a generator in the piano room / music room, and the classrooms can also have generators. there isn't a really good viable strat to try to find gens in indoor maps. The best way you can try to help yourself is recognizing distance between generators, and they still have the pole with the flashing lights on it. It just doesn't go through the roof or like stick out anywhere. But if you see it in the corner of your eye, like down a hallway, for example, that's how you know there's a gen over there. This is basically the best tips I can give for new players to try and find generators. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what happens when you get into chase as survivor. When the killer finds you, and inevitably will happen, how do you loop? How do you inevitably loop the killer for long enough to give your survivor teammates the upper hand? Well, there are different ways you can loop, because there are different tiles in jungle gyms that you have to loop in different ways depending on where you are at the time of the chase. For right now, I'm just going to be using Shack as an example. Now, as you can see, Shack has a window and it has a pallet. Now, depending on how much distance you have on the killer, you're either going to want to run the long way around, so the side where the window is actually blocked off. You can see it by these boarded pieces of wood that kind of like cover up a window. If you have a lot of distance, you want to run around the long side of Shack. This will give you an advantage by giving you the opportunity to go inside of Shack and fast vault out through the window. And then depending where the killer moves, you can counter rotate or, you know, adjust your movements to either go left or you can go right. I just want to also add a little side note on different vault speeds. There are fast vaults, medium vaults, and slow vaults. You can use fast vaults and slow vaults to your advantage during chases. A fast vault is when you put your legs up over the vault and kind of swing yourself through it. A medium vault is where you kind of put your legs on top of the vault and kind of climb over it. And then a slow vault is when you aren't holding the sprint button and vault a window, you'll kind of clamber over it. Now, for example, if you wanted to use a slow vault in chase, what you would do, if you have quite a bit of distance on the killer, if you start walking and then slow vault a window, there's a chance you'll get out of chase, and this means when you vault the window, you're not actually adding to the block counter, which means the next time around you can get another vault in. Another quick thing I want to talk about, because I mentioned walking and slow vaulting during chase. If you have a chance to walk during chases, this isn't actually a bad idea, because this could get you out of chase, which could give you advantages like being able to get extra vaults in or get your exhaust back. And it's all about the timing, right? If you have an exhaust perk and you want to be able to get it back during chase and you have enough time to walk, take a few seconds to start walking to start getting your exhaust timer to go down. And also it can kind of help you get out of chase completely, because you will stop leaving scratch marks when you stop running, so it can also give you a chance to get away from the killer. Now, something I want to mention as well, when I was running around the long side of Shack, as you can see is Dwight's face is kind of pushed into the wall. This is called hugging. Now, hugging is useful for Survivor because it allows you to cut corners more tightly to actually give you more distance. Instead of I was just running straight and then turning, it actually gets me more distance if I am just hugging the wall as tight as I can. So just keep that in mind while you're looping whatever you're looping. If it's a rock, you want to hug the rock. If it's T&Ls, which we'll talk about later, you want to hug the walls on the T&L walls, because it's going to give you more distance, allowing you to make it to the next loop or the next tile or make it to the window. The other thing you might have noticed that I was doing, I was looking behind me. Looking behind you, not constantly, but enough to gather information and how much distance you have. This is the most probably important thing to do while you're being chased, to tell how much distance you have between yourself and the killer. Now, you don't want to just constantly look behind you, because then you're going to run into something. What you want to do is, in optimal points while you're being looped, is take a second or two and look behind you to see, you know, how much distance you got. Certain moments you might want to keep your eye line on the killer. For example, as I'm vaulting out of Shack, I will sometimes look behind me and see what the killer's doing, because the killer might pull a move called a double back, which means they basically won't actually pursue the same direction I'm going. They will basically fake that direction and then actually counter rotate me in a different direction, trying to cut me off. Doing this is important because a lot of things happen in chases, basically 50-50s. These are scenarios where you're gonna have something happen and you have to make a split-second decision whether to either vault out through a window or not vault out through a window. So for an example here, imagine the killer is coming inside of Shack, and I'm about to vault out of the window. But at last second, before the killer even comes inside of Shack, they just keep going around Shack to the window. This is a split-second decision where if I vaulted out, I would have gotten hit. But if I choose not to vault out, I would actually be safe inside of Shack still. These are moments where you would have to look behind you to see what the killer is going to do, because the killer is going to try to trick you and get you injured or get you dead, because that's their objective. So this is why looking behind you is very key. The other key thing I'm going to talk about is when you're looping anywhere, there are points where you'll be around a corner, but don't just keep running. For example, if I stun the killer while I'm inside of Shack and the killer is on the outside of Shack, I will run to the outside at the other exit and I will wait at a corner so the killer can't see me, but I can see them. Now, depending on what the killer does, they might break the pallet, they might not break the pallet, and they could go around. This is why waiting at certain corners is key, because sometimes the killer is going to try to trick you and just try to cut you off because they're not expecting you to be waiting at the corner, watching their movement. So there are certain sections of tiles where this is a very optimal play to do as Survivor to outsmart the killer. The last thing I'm going to talk about is chaining. Chaining is very important. This is the thing you want to do. For example, if the pallet is thrown down and currently being broken by the killer, and I see that the window is blocked, what I need to do is get out of Shack and look for a place to chain, essentially, my next chase. There could be a rock with a pallet in it. This is just a standard little tile that I can chain to. Or I see a jungle gym that is T&Ls that I could try to make it to. These are important because you need to know how to chain your tiles and your jungle gyms together. You need to know how much distance you can make between each one, so when you use whatever you used up, you can make it to the next one and keep going. And with using all the other tricks I talked about before, between hugging, peeking corners, looking behind you, these tips should help you be able to get to other loops and other tiles and other jungle gyms easier. Now, I mentioned a lot about jungle gyms. I'm gonna go quickly and talk about each jungle gym and tile. Tiles are just your little pallets that are in between pieces of wood or a rock that don't have any specific repeating scenarios, right? It's kind of just a pallet is in between some pieces of junk. That's basically what a tile is. They're typically more unsafe than a jungle gym. Now, a jungle gym is a place like Shack, or this place, it's called T and L walls. Now, as you can see, why they're called T and Ls is one wall kind of is in a T shape and the other wall is in a L shape. I'm going to explain a little bit how to loop T and Ls. Basically, depending on how the killer is chasing you. For example, if they are going on the inside of T and Ls, you want to vault out and go around the T and L walls. If the killer decides to switch it up and go on the outside of the T and Ls, so for example, if I vault the T wall and the killer goes around the outside of the T, now I go on the inside of the T and Ls and vault out through the L wall. You basically do this multiple times until you either block both windows or until it becomes very unsafe. But this is the optimal way to loop T and Ls. Depending on where the killer is, if they go inside, you go outside. If the killer goes outside, you go on the inside. The other jungle gyms I'm going to talk about are the pallet jungle gyms. These are ones where either there is it basically looks like a C and it's a little bit long, and then there's another one that's a little bit short and there's a pallet in the middle of those. These are just your standard pallet jungle gyms. They're not really special. They don't have any windows. It's just a single pallet in between two walls. Then there are other pallet jungle gyms like this one that have a pallet, either a long wall or a half wall, and then there's a window on the far side. Now this window can change positions depending on how the wall next to the pallet is. If it's a one entire wall, there's normally a window there and the pallet will be on the other side instead. So basically it just kind of switches up. Sometimes the window will be on the far side on like an L looking wall, and the pallet will be on a wall that's kind of half broken, leaning up against a little tiny wall. These loops are pretty easy to loop. The standard pallet jungle gym is just loop the pallet basically because there's no window to vault. So basically you just hug the long wall, keep going around it until you have an optimal moment to either pre-drop or stun the killer. Pre-dropping is basically when you drop it before the killer gets there, so now the killer has to make a split decision whether to break it or go around, and either way you're making more distance. But just don't pre-drop every pallet. Only pre-drop it in specific scenarios. Also, sometimes when you're at these pallet jungle gyms, instead of pre-dropping or trying to stun the killer, you can do a fake, which basically means you pretend to drop the pallet, which will either have the killer respect, buying you extra distance to get away, or get some extra distance to be able to loop around the tile again. And the other pallet jungle gym, you want to loop it in a way where you're going through the pallet and around the outside and then back inside and vaulting out through the window. The only time you change this up is if the killer counter rotates you, which in that case, you basically loop it in reverse. So instead of going around the outside in the inside, you go around the outside and then go on the inside towards the pallet. These jungle gyms will typically be repeating across all maps. They might have different walls. For example, McMillan will have these kind of brick walls. Coldwind will have wood instead of brick. And Autohaven Wreckers maps will have like trash basically, but the layout of the jungle gyms are the exact same, repeating on across all maps. The only time you're not going to see jungle gyms like this or on indoor maps, but most outdoor maps have these jungle gyms. So if you can learn it on one map, you can learn it on every single map. A few small things I just want to mention with the more recent updates for Dead by Daylight is when someone is being chased, so your teammate, they will have these little tentacles around their player card that kind of wiggle back and forth. That is an indicator that they are in chase right now. So if you're worried that it's, for example, like a Michael Myers or a Ghostface and they are undetectable, you won't have to worry as much for them sneaking up on you if you see these little tentacles on somebody else. Something else you might have seen is these bigger spikes that almost completely surround a character's portrait. This is called the obsession. Now, the obsession doesn't do anything if no one has any obsession-related things. But for example, if a killer brings in a obsession-related perk, that can mean a multitude of different things. For example, the obsession could be in danger depending on what perk the killer brings in, or depending on what survivor perks you have a more increased chance to be the obsession, which could give the killer some indication that you might have certain perks. But even if no one brings in any obsession-related things, there will always be a obsession in every single match. Another thing I want to mention is if a killer is camping. Basically what camping is a killer is sitting around a survivor constantly. So like if they're on hook, they're just sitting right in front of them. There's a feature that DBD recently added called the anti-camp bar. This bar will basically fill up, and once it fills up, you can jump off hook. You're gonna have the endurance status effect, and you get another status effect that gets rid of your scratch marks, your pools of blood, and your grunts of pain. Now, if you don't know that the killer is camping, you can look at the little player icons. If you see this bar is filling up while someone's on hook, that means the killer is camping. Now, depending on how fast it's filling up, you can make a play between either just let them sit on hook and eventually they will actually jump off, or you can go and make the save. Little things to keep in mind to, understand what's going on in the game. All right, now I'm going to take some time and talk about how to basically play as killer. So when you're playing as killer, you might notice that there are crows around the map. If from a very far distance you see a crow just take off, that means a survivor has triggered that crow, and you can use that to your advantage by being able to find survivors if they're hiding. So keep an eye out for crows flying away. The next tip I want to talk about, moonwalking. Moonwalking is basically a thing that you can do to trick the survivors by making it unexpected that you're actually coming. Moonwalking is basically a thing where you turn around and keep walking backwards in the same direction, hiding your red stain so the survivors don't actually know where you're coming from. This can give you an upper hand on getting you a hit or, outplaying the survivor by cutting them off. Now, it might take some time to get used to being able to flip yourself around and keep walking backwards, but if you keep at it and keep practicing, I'm pretty sure you'll get good at it. Another thing I want to go over is if I down a survivor, but I see another survivor that has a flashlight, what I should do is not pick up the person I just downed. This tactic is called slugging, which is leaving a survivor on the ground to go chase somebody else. This is a viable tactic and useful for kind of snowballing a team. Now, I discourage playing scummy and, slugging the entire team for 4 minutes because that's just unsportsmanlike, but slugging can be a viable strat if used correctly and used optimally. I am also going to talk a little bit about tunneling. Now, tunneling straight off hook or tunneling one person straight out of the game immediately, it's honestly just unfun for the survivors. Tunneling should only be used in scenarios if the game is about to be over for you. For example, if there's one gen left and I just hook somebody and and I go find the one gen and kick it, and then come back and that person is being unhooked, this would be a time where tunneling, I would say, is okay. You could down the same person that you just hooked and get them out of the game, because this is basically eliminating one person out while there's still one gen left. This is basically a viable way to tunnel without being scummy, in my opinion. Another thing I want to talk about, which is a very big thing, is not chasing for too long. If you're in a chase and they're healthy and they're looping you, and you know it's been like 3 minutes and like 2 gens have popped in that time, you should probably stop chasing them. As annoying and obnoxious as it can be for a survivor chaining you between different loops over on repeat, if 2 gens are getting popped in that time, or the game is progressing extremely while you're chasing this one person, the best thing you should do is stop chasing them and go chase and do something else. A lot of people make this mistake of chasing for too long or getting really annoyed, and then they will keep chasing that person until they're dead, but you're actually throwing the game by doing that. Because for example, let's say you chase them for a minute and they waste like 3 pallets in that time. That's 3 pallets now that everyone else isn't going to be able to use. So by the time the game is almost wrapping up, let's say you have 2 people left and one is the really good survivor that you can't catch. By the end of the game, there's not going to be as many pallets and useful things left, so it'll be easier to actually catch the better person. So do not chase people for very long extended amounts of time. The only time this might be a good thing to do is if maybe they're injured. Another thing I want to talk about is if you have an opportunity to hook inside the basement. Hooking inside the basement can be very strong because the basement is the most unsafe place for survivors to be. For example, if I hook someone in the basement, which the best hook you should hook somebody in is the very back hook. That is the farthest distance that they need to go to get out of the basement. Now, the reason I say this is if you have someone in the basement, when they get unhooked, there is quite a bit of a time period before they get out. So, for example, if you wanted to get the other survivor, the unhooker, you have plenty of time to get back to, shack or main building to get to the basement and chase the other survivor. Something I'm going to mention, like I talked about with Survivor, is camping. Camping is not a good thing to do as killer anymore. Camping, you're basically giving the survivor an advantage. Hard camping is something I would 100% recommend not to do. So what I would recommend, if you think someone's going for the save, you can periodically check in on someone who's on hook without giving them complete anti-camp. But also, this doesn't mean you just sit 32 meters away with a hunter's hatchet up and camping, because you're actually wasting more time by sitting there and camping when you could be going out and chasing somebody else. I will just say this also, is that the anti-camp completely goes away once the last gen is popped. So if you at least want to secure 1 kill, you are able to do this during the end game when the anti-camp goes away. Next, I want to talk about lunging as killer. Now, lunging is basically when you hold the swing button down and move. This gives you a little bit extra distance to hit people. If you didn't hold down the attack button, you'll basically just do a swing. This is also helpful if, for example, the survivor is about to make it to a pallet. You can lunge almost through the pallet and be able to smack the survivor as they throw down the pallet. Next thing I'll talk about is a little bit how to loop certain jungle gyms as killer. Now, obviously, there is a lot to intake depending on what killer you're playing as, because each of them have powers, and their powers can help you in chase with certain jungle gyms. But if you were just playing as a very basic standard M1, which just means basic attack killer, this will be some insight and kind of how to loop certain jungle gyms. So if you are at shack, the strongest place for survivors, there are certain points you can end up cutting off the survivor, where if you double back or cut them off in certain ways. For example, if the survivor vaults out through shack window, what I can do is pretend to go one way and then actually double back into the window and vault out. This will make the survivor a little bit confused because they thought I was going to go one way and then I am actually vaulting out of the window. This will close some distance between the survivor trying to get around shack now to go for another vault. You can use that same tactic to counter T and L walls, and also just be careful at T and L walls when you're looping, because if you go on the inside, the survivor is going to go around the other side. So you can take that as an opportunity to double back essentially and try to cut the survivor off to get a hit in. And then your standard pallet jungle gyms. There are a few techs you can do here, like moonwalking, or you can do the dumbest thing, which is sometimes if you just hide your red stain for a couple of seconds and stand still, the survivor could get really confused, and then after like 3 seconds goes by, lunge around the corner into the pallet. Most of the time this will work because survivors like to wait at pallets to either get the stun or to fake it. So keep those tips in mind when you're chasing survivors as killer. I mean, I will always say, if you're a good survivor main, you make a good killer main. If you're a good killer main, you'll make a good survivor main. Next thing I'll talk a little bit about is I mentioned briefly about status effects between endurance, undetectable. These things are status effects that can be given to both sides, killer and survivor, that can either help you or hinder you. So really quickly, I'm going to go through every single status effect in the game, because there's not too many to go over. First thing I'm going to go over is Bloodlust. Bloodlust is something that you gain as killer when you're chasing a survivor for an extended amount of time. This basically gives you haste, but it's not haste. Haste is a different status effect, but it basically makes you move a little bit faster while you're chasing. The second you smack somebody or get stunned or do any inconspicuous action, you lose Bloodlust. Haste, on the other hand, is something that allows you to be able to be sped up. So if I'm a survivor and I have the perk Sprint Burst, the second I start running, I will move at 125% faster. Haste can be varied in lots of different ways, between just 5% or 7% or 125%, and this can be gained between killer and survivor to give you a little bit of a speed boost. This icon, you're in an area of effect that's been blessed. Now, a blessed totem is basically a perk that you can equip as survivor called boon totems. Boon totems are basically you walk up to a hex or dull totem and you bless it with a certain effect, and this will show up on the right side of your screen. Blindness. Blindness basically means you cannot see any auras. So you can't see gens if you're a killer, you can't see the aura of your survivors if you're a survivor. Basically, all auras that you can see are gone with the blindness status effect. The broken status effect. This basically means, as survivor, that you cannot be healed. Now, certain perks make this a permanent thing, like No Mither. No Mither makes it so you're permanently broken for the entire trial. And then there are certain add-ons or effects that can give this effect for a duration. This effect basically means that you are cursed by a hex totem. Hex totems are perks that killers can equip that give you a little bit of an advantage at the sacrifice of being a totem. Totems are things you can cleanse or boon, like I talked about earlier. But if you see this icon, that means the killer has a hex perk. And that means somewhere around the map, there is going to be a totem that is lit, kind of like this, that you should probably cleanse. Really quickly, I want to talk about how to find totems. Totems can spawn in lots of different places. A few to just keep track of. One can typically spawn in main buildings sometimes. One can also spawn in shack. And they can also spawn in jungle gyms. And also, it's pretty easy to judge the distance of totems because there are only 5 in the entire map. And it's normally pretty easy to tell how far away they have to be from each other to spread them all out. And indoor maps can be a little bit more confusing because they can kind of spawn in like these little tight cubbies that make it really difficult to see. But if you're good at judging distances between totems, which you'll eventually could learn with enough time and practice on, locating totems, it will become kind of easier for you to locate totems on indoor maps. Deafened. This is a status effect that is only affected by, I think, a few add-ons and a perk. This basically makes it so when you have this effect, you kind of have this muffled sound and it makes it really hard to hear. Deep Wound is a status effect that is only applied to you once you have the mend option. Basically what this is, it's a golden bar that will drain, and once this depletes, you will get down. What you have to do before this bar gets drained is mend yourself and cleanse yourself from Deep Wound before you go down. Certain killers or perks can add this effect to you as survivor. The Endurance status effect. What the Endurance status effect does is it makes it so you can't get downed. So basically what happens is if I'm injured and I get hit while I have the Endurance status effect, I will just get Deep Wound instead of going down. Exhausted. Exhausted basically means that if I have a perk that gives me exhaustion, I can't use it, or certain perks that will get rid of me grunting or breathing or anything like that, it will cancel out because I have the exhausted status effect. The exposed status effect. The exposed status effect is basically if I'm survivor, whether I'm injured or not, I will just get put into the down state. The only time this can be prevented is if I also have endurance to prevent myself from going down. Hindered status effect basically slows you down, which it will decrease your movement speed, making you walk or run slower. Incapacitated. This basically makes it impossible to interact with anything, so I couldn't touch a gen or totems or anything like that. Hemorrhage will basically produce more pools of blood, and it will make you lose healing progress over time. This will basically make it so killers can track you easier, and also if you get interrupted while you're healing, it makes it harder to heal in general. Mangled will make it so it's harder to heal, which basically means it will take longer to heal you than it would normally. Oblivious means that the killer is undetectable for you. That means they will not have a heartbeat or a red stain. The red stain is basically the thing that you see on the ground that the killer is projecting. Revealed status effect. This basically means that your aura is being revealed to the killer. And then undetectable. Undetectable means as killer, you have no tear radius, you have no red stain, nothing is being shown. Nothing that would give you away is being revealed to the survivors. And the last status effect is elusive. Elusive is a bit new. Elusive status effect will suppress grunts of pain, scratch marks, and pools of blood. It will also block your aura, but this only triggers once you get unhooked. Well, with all of that, I've tried to explain DBD to the best of my capabilities, so if you think I did a good job, maybe subscribe. But there's also a lot to this game, and a lot that I really didn't explain between, more advanced levels of playing this with techs and little tips and tricks between killers and survivors. Maybe I'll do another video going a little bit more in depth on tricks and tips for individual killers and survivors. But I think with all of that being said, I will see you in the next Dead by Daylight video.